I cannot get a bank account.
Debanked.
Debanked.
They didn't like his views. They believe they don't align with the bank's own values.
No other UK bank will have me. I've had 10 rejections.
If you don't have a bank account, you are a non-person.
If they can cancel me, they can cancel you.
Well, it may sound crazy, but banks in Britain can close your account if they don't like your political views or things you've posted online. It's a process colloquially known as debanking, and apparently thousands of people, perhaps tens of thousands, have been affected. Most of us hadn't even heard of the term until it happened to Nigel Farage, a friend of Donald Trump, who's best known for leading the Brexit movement. Here's what happened.
2 months ago, I get a phone call out of the blue from a personal manager who simply says on a phone call, "We are closing your accounts."
Nigel Farage is what we in Britain call Marmite, a yeast extract spread with a particularly strong flavour, which people either love or hate. And it's fair to say a lot of Brits love and hate Nigel Farage.
Complete failure. I've spotted that amount.
And they love and hate him for basically identical reasons. He successfully campaigned for Brexit.
Dare to dream that the dawn is breaking on an independent, united kingdom.
He's against illegal immigration.
We are not yet at peak crossings. Don't con yourself. This is not the peak.
And he doesn't like any kind of wokery.
Go woke, go broke.
So he's a controversial figure, but does Nigel Farage deserve to be debanked? Coutts, the Bank of King Charles, and his late mother, the Queen, evidently thinks he does. From the beginning, Farage suspected he was being debanked for his political views and not for any sound business reason.
They claim there's nothing political at all in what they're doing. It's purely a commercial decision.
But Farage's critics, notably present and former staff at the BBC, dismissed his claims of political persecution and insisted Coutts had taken a commercial decision. The BBC's business editor, Simon Jack, thought he had the big scoop when he tweeted that Nigel Farage's account was closed because he fell below the financial threshold required. In other words, didn't have enough money, quoting people familiar with the situation. Jack's former colleague, John Sopel, jumped on the bandwagon, tweeting, "You must feel a bit of a Charlie if you're Nigel Farage, and you claim that it's all an establishment stitch-up, when it's just you're not rich enough for Coutts." It looked like a big BBC scoop, but by the end of this whole thing, these men would be apologising to Nigel Farage. To find out what his bank really thought about him, Nigel Farage submitted what's called a subject access request, which all banking customers are entitled to do, and in response, Coutts sent him a 40-page report which revealed that their reputational risk committee did not think continuing to bank NF was compatible with Coutts, given his publicly stated views that were both at odds with our position as an inclusive organisation, meaning his views on ethnic minorities and LGBTQ rights and climate change and so on. Coutts didn't want him, even though the report acknowledges he is professional in his dealing with us and has not received any legal or other censure that we can establish. This was the proof, the smoking gun, that Farage had been looking for, and feeling vindicated, he went on national TV. Again.
They're all woke. They're all Remainer. They're all global.
The report makes it clear that the reason they closed his account was that Nigel paid off his mortgage.
Since that internal report was released, the head of NatWest, which owns Coutts, has resigned. Alison Rose also sent an apology to Nigel Farage. So has Simon Jacks and John Sopel. And even the head of BBC News, Deborah Turness, has written to apologise.
I have to say, never before in my public life career have I put my head over the parapet and received such support. I'm supposed to be a Marmite figure. Half the country is supposed to hate me. Well, some still do, but there's an awful lot who might not agree with me on borders or Brexit, but who are genuinely worried about this issue, and they're right to be. Because if they can do it to me, they can do it to you.
Okay, let's bring in our guest now, and we have the banking analyst, Frances Coppola, who we saw in that report, giving Mr. Farage a bit of a going over. We also have Ben Habib, a senior member of Reform UK. Welcome to the Nexus, both of you. Frances, if I may start with you, did you enjoy that little jousting match with Nigel Farage there?
I was terrified.
Really? I thought you were the one doing the terrifying. Look, you say that there were just purely commercial reasons that Coutts exited Nigel Farage. Do you still believe that?
Yes, absolutely.
Could you explain those commercial
Yeah,
reasons very briefly to the viewer?
Okay, there are two things. The first is that Nigel Farage had paid off his mortgage and because of that had fallen below the published financial criteria for having a Coutts account, which is that you have to have in excess of at least 1 million of borrowings or investments with them, or at least 3 million in liquid savings with them. He didn't meet those criteria and had not for some time after he paid off the mortgage, so they terminated his account. The second thing, which has been raised quite a bit, is their judgment of the reputational risk that he posed to them, which they considered to be very considerable, and on that basis decided they didn't really want to continue the relationship.
About the money he has in his account, it's well known, isn't it, that lots of Coutts clients have less than the formal amount required, but are still allowed to continue to bank with them.
Oh yeah. Yeah, but they're not Nigel Farage, and that was the point. It was the combination of those two things.
Yes.
The fact that it fell below the commercial criteria and the reputational risk that meant they didn't want him as a customer anyway.
Yeah, look, there is a third thing, and I don't know why you're running away from it, but you know they say in their dossier that it was also down to his views, and they've said that many times. His views running contrary to their views and their values. Do you accept that that was a very big part of it, and that they have a right to feel that way if they wish?
I don't really accept that it was a very big part of it, because it's evident from the bundle that they continued to bank him for several years despite disliking his political views.
OK, page 1 of the report then, and I'm sure you've got a good grasp of this report. Page 1, the committee did not think continuing to bank Nigel Farage was compatible with Coutts, given his publicly stated views that were at odds with our position as an inclusive organisation. This decision centred around inclusivity and purpose of the bank. Page 3, following the declassification of Nigel Farage from higher risk PEP to lower risk PEP, the client's EC is now sufficient to retain on a commercial basis. Page 9 and 10, when considering our stance specifically on ESG, diversity and inclusion, Black and Asian, minority ethnic equality, LGBTQ rights, Nigel Farage's comments and articles are not in line with our views and purpose, and so on, and so on, and so on. Their views, their purpose, and their values are mentioned time and time again as a reason that they are not compatible with him.
That's true, but they continued to bank him during all of that time. All of those excerpts date from evidence provided to a meeting in November 2022. The request to the meeting, if you look at the very first line on page 1, is that is a request to continue to the relationship with Nigel Farage. So they continued to bank him despite those views.
But in their discussions, it was clear that their views and his views did not align, and therefore they wanted to get rid of him. And on page 11, it says where they, the end of the mortgage, I put it to you, the end of the mortgage was merely a pretext to get rid of him. Because after making the case that Nigel Farage was a reputational risk and did not align with their values and purpose, the minutes then reveal that Coutts considers him a disingenuous grifter, and they go on to say, quote, I agree we should consider exit to coincide with the end of the mortgage term to reduce the risk of counter-criticism. In other words, it was an appropriate juncture at which to get rid of someone whose views do not align with theirs.
I think it says he is perceived as a disingenuous grifter.
And they hide behind that, but they are saying that that perception is exactly theirs.
No, it's the perception that matters, because what they're worried about is the effect on them of being perceived to bank someone like that. You should remember that Nigel Farage had in 2019 disclosed his banking relationship with Coutts to the Times. It was in the public domain. So people knew that he was banking with Coutts. The other customers knew, shareholders knew. So they were concerned that he would say or do something that reflected badly on them. That was the reason they decided not to continue the relationship.
Ben Habib, do you have any problem with Coutts exiting Nigel Farage?
Well, I mean, Frances has just confirmed that they exited him because of his views. I think, Frances, you just said that very neatly, that his views weren't compatible with theirs. They were concerned that he might bring them into disrepute, and so they terminated him as a customer of Coutts. But I think there's a much bigger issue here, and it seems, you mentioned it, Matthew, and I'm delighted you did, but it seems to be lost on most commentators, and it's the environmental and social governance obligations that all regulated businesses, all listed businesses, and most other large businesses and public bodies have to adhere to. Coutts has an obligation through ESG regulations to determine how it is going to do social justice and drive towards net zero. That's what the E and the S, the other way around, forgive me, but social justice through their social programs, and the E in the environmental is the drive towards net zero. Now, Nigel is vocal in his opposition to this relentless drive to net zero, and he's vocal in his opposition to what's called diversity and inclusion, which, just for those viewers who aren't familiar with it, is the promotion of ethnic minorities, different religious backgrounds, different sexual preferences and gender identity, the promotion of those minorities in the workplace, if necessary, to the detriment of the ethnic majority. And Nigel has a problem with that. And Coutts were caught in this difficult place where the regulatory framework, and indeed the regulator, and I'd like to talk about the FCA, were promoting, they were forced to promote this diversity and inclusive policy and net zero, which Nigel disagreed with, and they came head to head against Nigel over that issue. And they decided that their view had to prevail because that was how they were delivering their regulatory obligations. So the problem here, actually, is not so much Coutts as the actual framework of the regulations. So the problem is not just a Coutts problem, it's not just a banking problem, it's a problem that now faces the entirety of the British economic ecosystem. And we see it repeatedly.
Ben, who do you blame for that?
I blame initially EU regulations, but a government that has, through a whole host of different laws and regulations, foisted ESG obligations without defining precisely what they are, by the way, on UK PLC and indeed lots of all public bodies and so on. It's not just commercial entities which have to comply with ESG. And what's even more pernicious is that the ESG regulations require you to ensure that those with whom you deal similarly adopt ESG. So it's pervasive right through our system, and it's something that the government needs to look at very carefully. This mustn't be seen purely as a Coutts-NatWest problem or a banking problem. This is a problem for the entire British economic ecosystem.
Frances, I appreciate that you're saying that Coutts exited Nigel Farage for commercial reasons purely, but just to pick up on Ben's point there, do you think that banks in general are being sort of strong-armed into these positions where, in order to meet those standards, they have to get rid of people like Nigel Farage?
No, I don't actually, because Nigel Farage in many ways is a unique figure in UK politics. He's extremely divisive, extremely inflammatory. There will be other people that Coutts and other banks bank who have similar views to Nigel, but they're not spouting them all over the media and whipping up storms about them and agitating politically about them. That is the problem, really.
Frances, if I can just interject there, a lot of mild-mannered people I know have been debanked because of the positions and views they hold, including myself. And you may view some of the views I hold as unacceptable, but I think I'm a relatively mild-mannered, non-divisive individual. I try to see all sides of the argument. But I, too, don't agree with diversity and inclusion as a policy, and I, too, have serious question marks over net zero. And for my sins, I fought very hard against the Northern Ireland Protocol. And I think it was my fight against the Northern Ireland Protocol that prompted my bank in 2020. I've done a subject access request myself, so I'll find out. But I think it was my views on Northern Ireland and my desire to ensure that Northern Ireland was not broken out of the United Kingdom that got me debanked. And I can't think of a worse reason, frankly. I was fighting for the integrity of my country. And that, I suspect, was why I was debanked. This is much more pervasive than just Nigel Farage.
Ben Habib, we are just going to pause there for a moment. I've got a few other things I want to get to, and then we'll come back to those sort of points in a second. What do ordinary people think of this whole affair? We sent our producer to Coutts on the Strand to find out.
Was your bank right to close down Nigel Farage's bank account? No comment? One. Was Coutts right to close down Nigel Farage's bank account?
No,
No, why not?
because the bank cannot decide the kind of opinions you should have. That's not what a bank should be known for. You should be banking with your bank, not the bank telling you how you should think.
Do you think banks have the right to withdraw their services from a client like Nigel Farage over his political views?
No, but that's not why they withdrew the right for him to bank there.
Yeah.
But it just got contorted because he's a master manipulator.
Was Coutts right to take away Nigel Farage's bank account?
Yes.
Why so?
Oh, because he's a racist.
Where do you balance freedom of speech in this?
It doesn't really matter what the reason is. If they don't want to do business with somebody, like anybody else, I run a business. If I don't want to do business with somebody, because for whatever reason of mine, I don't do business with them. It's nothing to do with the government. It's a private business, and they can do a business with whoever they want.
Was this bank over here, Coutts, right to close Nigel Farage?
Yeah, Nigel. He's a nasty little fascist who spreads hate, and Coutts is absolutely right to shut it down. Freedom of speech is fine as long as it doesn't generate hate, which I think his does. So I think a line has to be drawn somewhere, and from my thinking, it falls the other side of Nigel Farage.
Some people might argue on the other side that banks are private institutions and they choose who they can do business with. And what do you make of that? Well, how would you respond?
Well, then I wouldn't bank at Coutts, obviously, because they are making the wrong decisions, and that privately is the way I believe. So it's competition, and if they're going to behave badly, well, I'll go somewhere else. But I'd never get into Coutts anyway.
No, you can say what you like, it's just that there are consequences. That's what happens with freedom of speech. You can say what you like, when you like, but if there are consequences, accept those. You should accept those.
In America, if a bank was to close your account based on your political views and what you post online, do you consider that an attack on freedom of speech?
I would imagine that it is.
We wouldn't stand for that in Texas. I can tell you that right now. There'd be a run on the Alamo.
Well, some interesting views there, but for a more scientific approach, take a look at this poll. An overwhelming majority, 62%, think banks should not be allowed to remove customers who have personal or political beliefs that don't align with the bank's values. And yet it appears to be happening, and not just to Nigel Farage. In 2021, Metro Bank closed several accounts used by Reform UK, formerly known as the Brexit Party. Last year, PayPal closed accounts run by the right-wing journalist Toby Young, the head of the Free Speech Union, later reinstated, of course. And just this month, an Anglican church leader had his account closed after complaining that his building society was allegedly pushing transgender ideology.
If all the banks do that and they start jettisoning customers who may be Muslims and may believe in the Quran's teaching on sexual ethics, they may be Christians like myself, believe in the Bible's teaching on sexual ethics. If those sort of customers are now not going to be allowed to have bank accounts, we're in trouble, aren't we? You know, because bank accounts these days, it's about as basic as having electricity in your house or like a utility, having water. And if that gets cut off just because you hold a different worldview to the water company, obviously we'd have a lot of people be very upset about that. So the fact is it's in the banking sector. And I would love to really remind, in my small story, if it has any effect, I hope it would remind the banks, just do what you're there for. You don't need to have a social engineering policy. You don't need to interfere in this area.
So what is the British government going to do about it? Well, they certainly sound like they're going to make a change.
It wouldn't be right if financial services were being denied to anyone exercising their right to lawful free speech. Our new Financial Services and Markets Act puts in place new measures to ensure that politically exposed persons are being treated in an appropriate and proportionate manner.
According to a government press release, the changes will increase the notice period to 90 days, giving customers more time to challenge a decision. They will also be required to spell out why they are terminating a bank account, boosting transparency for customers and aiding their efforts to overturn decisions. The Economic Secretary to the Treasury, Andrew Griffith, well, he says the changes will boost the rights of customers, providing real transparency, time to appeal, and making it a much fairer playing field. Back to our guest now. Frances Coppola, do you think these changes are necessary?
I don't have a problem with there being a longer notice period for closing an account. People need time to sort themselves out. And one of the issues here, the underlying issue that isn't being talked about, is how much competition there is, how much diversity there is in the banking marketplace, and what realistic alternatives people have if their accounts are closed for some reasons. So that needs to be looked at, particularly business accounts, where at the moment there's no backstop, there's no right to a business account as there is to a personal account. That's something I'd like to see the government looking at, because I think too many businesses have had their accounts closed down and haven't really got anywhere else to go. But I'm not convinced by the having to give them a reason thing, because actually banks can't give a reason for closing an account that's been closed for reasons of suspected financial crime, of money laundering or something like that. So
but where that's
because that's can I finish? Because that's tipping off. So if they're giving
Yes.
reasons to everybody else and suddenly don't give a reason, then they're tipping off.
Understood. Ben, are you happy with the new regulations that are going to come into place? And do you accept Frances's contention that if you give a reason, then there's the potential there for tipping off?
Well, I think the government response is wholly inadequate. As we've just discussed, the root of the problem lies in an ill-defined regulatory requirement to comply with environmental, social governance regulations. And what the government needs to do is row right back on what ESG is, and this obligation to adhere to something that is badly defined and is adopted by people in different ways with different outcomes that are entirely arbitrary as far as I can see. That's where the government's focus should be, not increasing, well, I mean, they can increase notice periods for cancellation by all means, and whether or not they give reasons is almost academic. The fact is, people shouldn't be judged based on their ideological positions and their political views and what they may or may not say in the public domain. It's just completely wrong. So there's a much more fundamental approach that government has to take, in my opinion, and it's got to unwind right across the entire economic ecosystem this application of environmental social governance principles.
Frances, the CEO of NatWest, obviously the parent company of Coutts, resigned. Alison Rose, do you think that she did the right thing there?
Yes, I do. I think the bank has actually handled this very badly. Their communication on this has been inept to the point of, incompetence. They should have had, they knew, because it's stated in the document bundle, they knew that Nigel would be likely to kick up a fuss and very publicly when his account was terminated. But they don't seem to have put in place a communication strategy to deal with it. And so we've had a chief executive making off-the-cuff remarks at a private dinner to a BBC journalist. That's not okay. They should have had a media blackout and communicated through cleared press briefings only. It was a mess.
Nigel Farage, just briefly, Nigel Farage has implied that, of course, you'd expect people in the banking industry and the corporate world to collude with the BBC because they're all against Brexit. Frances, do you accept that's why she told him what she told him?
No, I think it's nonsense, to be frank. Okay. I think that this is just a pure case of a bank that really hadn't got its act together. She was the chief executive of that bank that hadn't got its act together, and therefore she had to go. Straightforward.
Ben, she went, and Nigel Farage would like to see far more people resigning. Do you think that is proportionate?
I actually think an insufficient number of directors have resigned. The only correct outcome, as far as I'm concerned, is all the directors at NatWest have to go and all the directors at Coutts. And it's one point we haven't discussed, Matthew, and I'd welcome Frances's opinion on this, is that Coutts is an independent company with an independent banking license. Its clients' information is proprietarial to Coutts. Alison Rose wasn't a director of Coutts. Coutts should not have been passing up to Alison Rose any information about Nigel Farage's bank account. They're separately regulated entities, and they should have been separated from the start. So there's clearly a breach within the NatWest group of companies of good corporate governance. And that breach applies to the board of the Coutts board of directors, as well as the board of directors for NatWest. And remember, NatWest backed up Alison all the way until she resigned, until 1 a.m. last night, whenever it was. And so I'm afraid they all have to go. They're all guilty of breaching data protection, the Data Protection Act, and they've got to go. You can't run a bank with those kind of breaches in place. And I come back to the FCA. Where is the FCA in all of this? Where is the Financial Conduct Authority?
Ben Habib and Frances Coppola, thank you so much for your contributions to the Nexus today. Much appreciated. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. If you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes again, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Till next week then, goodbye.